This is a white man's country. This is a white man's world. The white man from Europe dominates the whole planet. White men goes into any country and kill everybody, take over anything they want. This is a white man's country. It's a white man's world. I'm not bragging about it. I'm just telling you the fact of the matter. White people out of Europe have dominated Europe and have dominated then Europe has dominated the world. And so England has manipulated and exploited the races, the peoples of the world. The white man has been using exploitation, commerce to manipulate and exploit the whole human race.
Yes, we can say that the European nations are ruling the world, but where did they get their power? Many of them believe they are in power because of the myth they created about white superiority. But what's really happening is that the ruling elite are following in the footsteps of Cain, Nimrod, and Esau. So in this session, we will continue the discussion about the true enemies of the kingdom and their plan to control the world. What we will find is that the same pagan god is being worshipped by those with black skin, white skin, and every color in between. The most interesting part of this is that all of the different religions of the pagans point back to a melanated god. Bacchus, Nimrod, Osiris, Apollo, all the names they've attached to these gods will take them back to Babylon and Nimrod. So before we make the connection between Nimrod and Esau, let's do a quick recap. In the last session, we said that Nimrod was a title like Pharaoh or Caesar. We also talked about the two possibilities for why Nimrod was not listed with the other sons of Cush in the genealogy. One of the reasons given was that he was born much later than the other sons, and the other was that Nimrod was a distant descendant of Cush. So let's look at Jasher 7:23, and we'll see here that it's saying he was born much later. So it says, "And Cush the son of Ham, the son of Noah, took a wife in those days in his old age, and she bare a son, and they called his name Nimrod, saying, At that time the sons of men again began to rebel and transgress against God. And the child grew up, and his father loved him exceedingly, for he was the son of his old age." Let's continue on with the story of Nimrod, and then we're going to tie him in with Esau. And this is Jasher 7:34 through 41. I'll read some of it and summarize the rest. But pay close attention to these verses, because here's the turning point for Nimrod. It says, "And when Nimrod was 40 years old," make note of his age. So at this time, a war breaks out between the sons of Cush and the children of Japheth, and the Japhethites place the sons of Cush in subjection. So Nimrod assembled his brothers and brought in some of his friends and acquaintances and went to war against the children of Japheth. But I'll pick up where he's talking to this group that's going to war with him in verse 36. "And he said to them, Do not fear, neither be alarmed, for all our enemies will be delivered into our hands, and you may do with them as you please." Sounds a bit like Christopher Columbus, don't it? And the men, it says all the men that were about or went about with him were about 500. And they fought against their enemies, and they destroyed them, and then they subdued them, and Nimrod placed standing officers over them in their respective cities. And he took some of their children as security. Now, I thought that was pretty wicked, because these are his relatives here. "And they were all servants to Nimrod and to his brethren, and Nimrod and all the people that were with him turned homeward. And when Nimrod had joyfully returned from battle, after having conquered his enemies, all his brethren, together with those who knew him before, assembled to make him king over them, and they placed the regal crown upon his head, and he set over his subjects and people princes, judges, and rulers, as is the custom amongst kings. And he placed Terah the son of Nahor the prince of his hosts, and he dignified him and elevated him above all his princes. So just so you know, this is Abraham's father that he's talking about. He places him over his army and all of his princes, and he makes him one of the most important people in his kingdom. Let's keep going. All right, continuing on with Jasher 7:45 through 51. Now that Nimrod has become king, all of the nations start gathering themselves to him. They come to him, give him offerings, bow down to him, and he became their Lord and king. They gave him permission to become their Lord and king. So it also talks about how Nimrod then would proceed to make gods of wood and stone. Let's pick up with 47. And he, meaning Nimrod, made gods of wood and stone, and he bowed down to them, and he rebelled against the Lord and taught all his subjects and the people of the earth his wicked ways. And Mardon, his son, was more wicked than his father. This son was so wicked, the people actually came up with a saying that said, "From the wicked goeth forth wickedness." You can imagine that the son is even more wicked than the father. So I'll go on to verse 49, where it talks about Abraham's father, and it says, "And Terah, the son of Nahor, prince of Nimrod's hosts, was in those days very great in the sight of the king and his subjects. And the king and princes loved him, and they elevated him very high. And Terah took a wife, and her name was Amphilo, the daughter of Cornebo. And the wife of Terah conceived and bare him a son in those days. Terah was 70 years old when he begat him, and Terah called his name, or called the name of his son that was born to him, Abram, because the king had raised him in those days and dignified him above all his princes that were with him." Let's keep going. What we also have to remember is that this governing and religious system that began with Nimrod spread throughout the world after the confusion of the tongues, to include the symbols. So all of the great civilizations and empires would continue to perpetuate this paganistic rule of government that began in Babylon, and a lot of the imagery would later be found in Egypt.
Let's go back to Egypt. We'll start in Egypt because that's one of the oldest civilizations on the earth. To represent the sun. It's an equal armed cross within the circle. Here is an artifact that was found in England. It's unhinged. It's on a golden circle, which represents the sun. And then you'll see the cross in between. And this is about 4,500 years old. Almost 5,000 years ago, ancient mankind drew pictures of what they perceived the sun to be as an equal armed cross. And you will see it also in the ancient religions of the Near and Middle East, the different ancient gods in the Phoenician, Canaanite, Sumerian systems. They all had the equal armed cross.
Guess what else is an equal armed cross? Yep, the swastika, an ancient symbol in the form of an equal armed cross with each arm continued at a right angle, used in clockwise form as the emblem of the German Nazi Party. But we know where else this is used. Are you all getting this? All of these symbols mean something. There's a reason the KKK adopted the swastika. The children of darkness are communicating. They know what these things mean. They get an upper hand on us because we don't know what they mean. But now we know how vitally important these symbols are. They mean something. They represent a belief system. Let's look at this excerpt from worldhistory.us. It says the quad pantheon: Ham, Cush, Nimrod, and Semiramis. The gods of various cultures and ages can be linked by noting like customs, festivals, symbolism, depictions, and etymology of names. Also by comparing mythologies and the comments of ancient historians, the Bible, and other sources. Much has been learned about how these systems evolved. So it talks about Saturn, Apollo, Zeus, Jupiter, Isis, Venus, Aphrodite, Mary. All of these names can be traced back to Ham, his son Cush, his son Nimrod, and his wife Semiramis. Nimrod, or Ninus, meaning the sun, is the first king listed in the most ancient Assyrian Babylonian king lists, making his wife the first queen. Of the four, Nimrod was first to be deified, hailed as the seed or Messiah, and worshipped via the sun. His connection with the sun may have been inherited from Ham, whose name meant burnt or burning one. Other translations I've seen say burnt face. But it says later, after the deification of Semiramis, he also came to be worshipped as the son of the great goddess mother, the divine mother, and the queen of heaven. So this source goes on to say that Cush is said to have founded Babylon as Bel, while his son built the city. And there's also evidence that Semiramis, being the first deified woman, was the archetype or the mother goddess, as alluded to. So she became the Virgin Mary via the cult of the fertility goddess, or it may be better said that the Virgin Mary became her. But the one thing we have to understand is that it's one thing to force people to do your bidding using fear as a motivator, but chances are the person will overcome that fear one day and choose not to do what you're wanting them to do. But when you add in a religious component, you can win their hearts, because now they're willfully serving because they believe that they're serving God. So the religious component is extremely important when you need to change a mindset. This is why the oppressors gave us religion. You had to either convert to Islam or Christianity or die. So Lucifer used Nimrod to win the minds and hearts of the people through pagan worship. All right, let's keep moving. Now I'm going to skip forward even more to Jasher 9:20 through 21, so that we can see who masterminded this Tower of Babel idea. All right, it says, and King Nimrod reigned securely, so we don't know how long this has been since they crowned him king. It says he reigned securely, and all the earth was under his control, and all the earth was of one tongue and words of union. And all the princes of Nimrod and his great men took counsel together, Put, Mizraim, Cush, and Canaan, with their families. And they said to each other, come, let us build ourselves a city, and in it a strong tower, and its top reaching heaven, and we will make ourselves famed, so that we may reign upon the whole world, in order that the evil of our enemies may cease from us, that we may reign mightily over them, and that we may not become scattered over the earth on account of their wars. And they all went before the king, and they told the king these words, and the king agreed with them in this affair, and he did so. So we have an idea of what happened next. They began building this tower, and the Most High confused the language, and the thing they didn't want to happen happened anyway. They were scattered. But what did they take with them? The story of Nimrod and the pagan religion. Only now they're talking about this in their new language. So what we're going to see is that all of these different religions point back to one man and the gods of wood and stone that began here in Babylon. But think about how long it must have taken them to build this tower. Jubilee said that the building was going on for about 43 years. So that puts Nimrod now at about 83, if this happened shortly after he began to reign. And we know that folks back then did live longer, and some of them lived much longer than others, like Shem. Shem lived to be 600 years old. So this is where it gets interesting because, as I said last time, some sources say Shem killed Nimrod, cut him into pieces, and sent his body throughout the kingdom as a warning not to serve pagan gods. But Jasher identifies Esau as the killer. So we're going to keep going to see if we can find a happy medium here. Now we're making the Nimrod-Esau connection. And again, I'm skimming through this. This is coming from Jasher 27, 1 through 9. You're welcome to read all this when you get a chance. It says, and Esau at that time, after the death of Abraham, frequently went in the field to hunt. So take note that Abraham has died, and we know from Scripture that he died at 175 years old. So again, how old would Nimrod need to be at this point if he's the same Nimrod? All right, in verse 2 it says, Nimrod, king of Babel. The same was Amraphel. That's important. We'll talk about him. Also frequently went with his mighty men to hunt in the field. So it goes on to talk about how Nimrod is out hunting with his men, and he's off with 2 men while the rest of his mighty men go off hunting elsewhere. But it talks about this certain day that Esau went into the field to hunt, and he saw Nimrod walking in the wilderness with these 2 men. And it talks about how he took note, that all of the mighty men were not there, and that he disguised himself, concealed himself from Nimrod, and lurked for him in this wilderness. So I'm going to pick up with verse 6. It says, and Nimrod and his men that were with him did not know him, talking about Esau, and Nimrod and his men frequently walked about in the field at the cool of the day, and to know where his men were hunting in the field. And Nimrod and 2 of his men that were with him came to the place where they were, when Esau started suddenly from his lurking place and drew his sword and hastened and ran to Nimrod and cut off his head. And Esau fought a desperate fight with the 2 men that were with Nimrod, and when they called out to him, Esau turned to them and smote them to death with his sword. And all the mighty men of Nimrod who had left him to go to the wilderness heard the cry at a distance, and they knew the voices of those 2 men, and they ran to know the cause of it when they found their king and the 2 men that were with him lying dead in the wilderness. So Esau hid himself. Then he did a surprise attack. And by the time these mighty men got there, Nimrod was dead, and the 2 men who were with him. So imagine they find this king dead. They didn't know who did it because Esau fled. But how embarrassing would it have been for them to go back and make a report that someone had killed their king, and none of them were able to protect him. So I was just thinking out loud that this is possibly where that story came from about Tammuz being killed by a wild boar. I mean, it would provide a good explanation that, hey, we don't know who killed our king, so we'll just say about a wild boar killed him. But anyway, again, just thinking out loud there. So you can let me know, and I'll tell you why I'm thinking that way as we go on. Let's keep going. All right, so let's pick this up from Jasher 27, 10 through 12. And when Esau saw the mighty men of Nimrod coming at a distance, he fled and thereby escaped. And Esau took the valuable garments of Nimrod, which Nimrod's father had bequeathed to Nimrod, and with which Nimrod prevailed over the whole land, and he ran and concealed them in his house. So the backstory on these garments. they're supposed to be the garments that the Most High had given to Adam, and Adam gave them to Seth, and it eventually passed on to Noah, who took them into the ark. But when they were leaving the ark, Ham stole them from Noah and gave them to his son Cush. And then Cush would then give them to Nimrod. But apparently these garments of skin made the person wearing these clothes strong when he put them on, and he would be given might and strength. And you can read more about that in Jasher 7, but let's keep reading this with verse 11. And Esau took those garments and ran into the city on account of Nimrod's men. And he came unto his father's house wearied and exhausted from fight. And he was ready to die through grief when he approached his brother Jacob and sat before him. And he said unto his brother Jacob, Behold, I shall die this day. And wherefore then do I want the birthright? So he thought they were going to track him down. And Jacob acted wisely with Esau in this matter, and Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, for it was so brought about by the Lord. We're going to keep reading, and then I'll comment on this. Now let's pick up with Jasher 27:15 through 17. And when Nimrod, the son of Cush, died, his men lifted him up and brought him in consternation and buried him in his city. And all the days that Nimrod lived were 215 years, and he died. And the days that Nimrod reigned upon the people of the land were 185 years. And Nimrod died by the sword of Esau in shame and contempt. And the seed of Abraham caused his death as he had seen in his dream. And at the death of Nimrod his kingdom became divided into many divisions, and all those parts that Nimrod reigned over were restored to the respective kings of the land, who recovered them after the death of Nimrod. And all the people of the house of Nimrod were for a long time enslaved to all the other kings of the land. So, if we're comparing this story to the story of how Semiramis collected the parts of his body, it does not fit with the story. Also, Nimrod was 215 years old when he died. Abraham had already died at 175 years old. So could this possibly have been the same Nimrod? Well, in the previous verses we read about how Nimrod had a son, Mardon, who was even more wicked than his father. So why didn't the kingdom pass on to him if he was still alive? That doesn't fit with this narrative right here, which is why I'm thinking this wasn't the same Nimrod. It's possible it could be the one that they say was killed by the wild boar, Tammuz. I'm not saying that it's for certain, but I mean, that story would be more likely than them saying somebody killed the king and we don't know who did it. But what I'm showing you here is that these are some of the things called into question, and people are, trying to say, well, we're not thinking, or we're thinking that this book of Jasher couldn't be authentic. But let's keep going and we'll come back to that. So we want to know if this Nimrod that Esau killed is the same one from the beginning. So this comes from Amraphel, king of Shinar. It says, in Jerome's translation of Eusebius's chronological canon, the invasion of Amraphel is dated by implication to the reign of the Assyrian. And we're talking about the Mesopotamian king Zames, son of Ninus. It says, as the birth of Ishmael is dated there to the 36th year of Zames's 38-year reign, and the call of Abraham at 75 years of age to the 23rd year of Zames, and the war of Amraphel fell between these two dates. nearer the latter of them according to Genesis 14. This chronological scheme seems to have been borrowed by Eusebius from the great pre-Nicene church historian Africanus. So it goes on to say that Zames was the king who persecuted Abraham because he refused to worship his idols, leading to the migration of Abraham to Palestine. And it also says this king, King Zames, is usually referred to by the Arabs as Nimrod, son of Canaan. And they're saying that he's the one who threatened to throw Abraham in a furnace if he refused to worship his idols. So it also goes on to say that Nimrod, son of Canaan, is represented in these sources as the second Nimrod, and Nimrod 1 being Nimrod, son of Cush. So Nimrod was believed among Arab chroniclers to be a title applied to all subsequent kings descended from Nimrod, son of Cush. And we covered a lot of that last time, but this timeline here of Amraphel, this king, is helping to connect the dots about which Nimrod we're talking about. And you can read this story in Genesis 14 where it talks about the battle of the kings and how Abraham went out to fight against those kings that had taken Lot captive. And I do want to insert something here because there are those who are saying that Jasher, the book of Jasher, is not credible. So they're trying to debunk it. They say it's not credible for some of the reasons, really, that I'm covering today, the issues about the ages and the timeline for Nimrod. And they also talk about the stories in Jasher. They say they're too fanciful when it talks about how Jacob and his sons fought against the enemies around them. Supposedly, they say, it makes them look like superheroes, so the book should not be considered credible. But if you read Genesis 14, where Abraham went after those 4 kings and their armies, he only had 318 men, his servants, really, and he defeated them and brought Lot back. How is that even possible? 318 men against kings and their armies? Come on. So should we throw out the book of Genesis too? How is it that Samson killed over 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey? Should we throw out the book of Judges? And how many prophets of Baal did Elijah kill exactly? So do you see where I'm going with this? But I digress. All right, so let's go on. So, I mean, it's worth the study to see, is it that we're misinterpreting some things? That there were incorrect translations made, which is certainly possible. Those are the things we want to know first before we just say, well, just throw away the book. Don't read it anymore. Let's keep going. Just a little more on this before moving on. It says, there is therefore perfect accord between the traditions. Amraphel, who was the same person as Nimrod B, Ninus B, or Zames, was supposedly the king who persecuted Abraham and caused him to leave Mesopotamia for the land of Canaan. It goes on to say the underlying connection between this tradition and the Arabic one of the persecution of Abraham is proved by the assertion in the Byzantine sources that the god-man Bel, or Zames, was the same god whose worship Nebuchadnezzar attempted to impose on the 3 Hebrew children on penalty of being cast into the furnace. Then it goes on to say Zames, or Amraphel, and the king in whose reign Abraham received his call out of Ur of the Chaldeans is the same person. So if you would do a study on the Chaldeans, you'll see that they were into divination, astrology, sorcery. They were the magicians. And this is why the Most High told Abraham to get up out of his country, to get away from his people. They were idol worshippers, sun worshippers to be exact. And that is the mantle that Esau inherited from Nimrod. He would spread this political and religious system to the nations he mixed himself with. Even though they changed the names and the skin color, they were worshiping the same God. Watch this.
Part of it, so that everyone could agree to follow one religion which Caesar would rule from. He would rule from. And so it was a political move. That's all.
It was much more than a political move. It allowed them to unite the power of church and state. So hopefully you're seeing what Nimrod actually did. He made it possible for the seed of the serpent to begin working on the plan that would unite mankind under the kingship and lordship of Lucifer, so that the order of things would go back to the way it was before the flood. For Satan to reign and rule, he has to change the natural order of creation. His power is at its greatest capacity when there's darkness and disorder. Think about Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. They had darkness, void, and chaos. Now think about what's happening right now. The work that's being done is designed to change the proper order of things. The confusion of the sexes, DNA splicing, the creation of hybrid beings and animals, the mixing of man with machine, the plan to dim the sun. This all leads to chaos. Well, after the flood, there was a reset. But what the fallen angels did was they left symbols and markings on rocks so that they could communicate the plan to the next generation. Now, the confusion of the languages after the Tower of Babel brought about another reset. It delayed things, but the symbols are helping them to put it all together, especially now that they have technology. It allows them to accelerate their work. Let's read this. This comes from CrossQuest, and again, it's from worldhistory.us. It's talking about the seed and the sun. It says the ancient pagans were well aware of the original prophecy later recorded in Genesis about the seed of a woman who would slay the serpent. It was even incorporated in the symbol of the sun disk. In Chaldee, 0, or the O, meant 0 just as it does today, but it also meant the seed. So the circular symbol of the sun also signified the seed, who they deemed to be the nearness or the son of the woman Semiramis. This duality of meanings allowed the idolatrous system to function secretly alongside the patriarchal system, which rested primarily on Noah. This is why there's so much secrecy around this. It says in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium, when these cross symbols began to be used, the gods and goddesses they represented had recently been political rulers. So there was no separation of church and state. Hence, these symbols had political as well as religious meaning. Later kings were thought of as gods because they had descended from or received authority from people who had already been deified. So lineage became important to royalty. Do you all know that when they anoint the kings and queens of England, they actually say they become divine? Yeah. All right, let's continue with this. We want to pick up now with Esau. So we've moved from Cain building the city to Nimrod, the kingdom, now Esau ruling the world. He moved the needle forward because the prophecy had already been given that he represented a nation. So his part was to mix himself with the nations, then eventually take control of it. He mixed with the Horites, then waged war against them and took over. He's the great colonizer, but a lot of it has been done secretly. Esau is the end of the world. So his seed is behind the ruling elite of the world. The Edomites also use many different names: Esau, Edomite, Isaurian, Illyrian, Idumean, and there are others. And they normally marry into royal families. Let's just say they are your royal families. Nimrod's son Zepho ruled in Italy. They made them king, and he fought their wars. Jasher 90 tells us that Edom became one with Chittim. Chittim is Rome, and Israel was not immune. Let's read this. It says in 126 BC, the Edomites were conquered by the Maccabean ruler John Hyrcanus and were absorbed into the Jewish state. Again, they mix and then they take over, where they were forced to observe Jewish rites and laws, and the Edomites became a section of the Jewish people. From this time onward, Edom became known as Idumea, from which arose the Herodian dynasty. The historian Flavius Josephus tells us Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans, at which time therefore this befell them, that they were hereafter no other than Jews. By 63 BC, the Romans conquered Palestine, and the Herods of Idumea were placed in power over Judah. Now, last time I asked the question at the end of the session about 2 Baruch 67 and 7, where it says, "But the king of Babylon will arise, the one who now has destroyed Zion, and he will boast over the people and speak haughtily in his heart before Yahweh the Most High." So my question was, who do you think the verse is referring to? And many of you felt that it was talking about Nimrod, that perhaps the powers that be will use their technology to clone him, using DNA from his bones. And some said it's talking about the Antichrist or the Pope. It certainly could be some type of recreated being using Nimrod's DNA. But most importantly, I believe this man will walk in the spirit of Nimrod, much like how Messiah said John came in the spirit of Elijah. We know for sure that he will embody the wickedness of the first ruler of Babylon, and he will be controlled by Lucifer. Truly, he will be a man of sin. And finally, we will wrap up with this verse from Isaiah 14:3 through 7. But one quick announcement before we end. We here, those of you who are asking for some live sessions, we will look at it sometime in the near future. I definitely understand that there are times when a live session would be beneficial. When you finally get it, or you have a light bulb moment, you want to share it with someone. So as I said, I get it. We will work on that and we'll get back to you about it. So all right, family, let's read this from Isaiah 14:3 through 7. "In that wonderful day when the Lord gives his people rest from sorrow and fear, from slavery and chains, you will taunt the king of Babylon. You will say, 'The mighty man has been destroyed.' Yes, your insolence is ended. For the Lord has crushed your wicked power and broken your evil rule. You struck the people with endless blows of rage and held the nations in your angry grip with unrelenting tyranny. But finally, the earth is at rest and quiet. Now it can sing again." I hope that you enjoyed this session. Join me next time. Shalom, everyone.